You talk to hundreds of people in tech. Like, what proportion of them fall into this category where you see them as activists who are trying to improve things?
It can be hard to identify them because I think a lot of the executives have learned how to talk like they are ethical technologists. But you really have to look at actions. I mean, one of the principles I look at in the book is this idea of consequentialism, of sort of the need for technologists to kind of measure their success not based on how they intended their products to work, but on how their products actually work out in the world. When you say, Mark Zuckerberg, your newsfeed algorithm is tearing society apart or leading to more polarization, the fallback response is always, well, we built this with good intentions. And what I'm trying to tell people is, like, it doesn't matter. Like, your intentions are it's good that if they're good, but what ultimately matters is how this technology is applied out in the world. And,
That's a very strange standard, man. Like, if I'm a doctor and then I do something messed up, and then it's like like whatever, I operate on the wrong leg, and then they'd be like, "Hey, that was the wrong leg." I'd be like, "Well, I intended it to be the right leg." I mean,
right.
that's not exactly like a compelling argument in just about any field.
Right. But you hear that all the time in tech. And I think it's really ingrained in them that as long as you have good intentions, your job is just to create the technology, and how people use it is up to them.
Welcome back to Yang Speaks. It's good to be with y'all. Hope you're all holding up okay. This is Zach Grauman, one of the co-hosts of Yang Speaks. Look, we're going to do two things today on this episode. Number one, we've got Kevin Roose joining with Andrew for a conversation. Kevin Roose is a New York Times tech columnist and was the first reporter to write an article about Andrew Yang as a presidential candidate. First, he called him a longer than long shot. And I've joked with Kevin since then. I was like, thank you for doing that, because that was just motivation. He jokes, like, we laugh at me. He's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't call him that. I'm not sure. But I blew that quote up and I put it on the campaign HQ wall. And I said, team, that's our floor. And it was funny because we went from long and the long shot to 538 called us a semi-serious candidate. And then we were called a candidate by CNN. And then we were a major candidate by 538. And then it was all the crazy headlines you've seen over the years of us running. So Kevin Roose, the man who started it all, he's got some really insightful stuff on the internet and YouTube algorithms and how they're fueling the far right and far left and making us more divided. He's a pretty insightful guy, and Andrew and him are cut from similar cloths in that sense. So I hope you enjoy that. Before to that, I want to give you all a breakdown on the record-breaking stimulus package that was just passed by the Biden administration. I'm going to break down exactly what's in it, and then I'm going to talk about our opinions, the Yang view. So, breakdown of the American Rescue Plan for coronavirus relief that was just passed starts right now. All right, what is in the new American Rescue Plan just passed by the Joe Biden administration? The American Rescue Plan is a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill with five main components. I'm gonna break them all down very quickly. Number one, most importantly, $1,400 stimulus checks to the people. We're hoping for $2,000. They said it's if you combine the $600 we got earlier, it's $2,000, whatever. We'll take what we can get. So if you make under $75,000 a year, or a married couple making under $150,000 per year, you are eligible. And what does that mean? It's $1,400 per person and $1,400 per dependent. So kids, people that are dependent on others for their income, according to your 2020 tax return last year. Number two, so that's number one. Number two, it's going to continue the $300 per week boost to unemployment checks through September of 2021. So if you lost your job and you filed for unemployment, this is solid money in addition to what you can get. So normally, depending on the state, you can get $100 to $500 per week in unemployment benefits. And this is $300 stacked on top of that. And then they're going to waive your federal income taxes on that money up to the first $10,200 for households earning under $150,000. So if your household earns under 150K, you don't pay taxes on this money either. Number 3, there's a lot of tax credits here, specifically the child tax credit in 2021. So we don't love tax credits, guys. I think the hardest part of them is that you have to actually file taxes and have to file them right. Many people don't know how to do that, but it is better than nothing. So right now you can get a $2,000 tax credit per child up to age 17. That is going to go up to $3,600 for children up to age 5, and as much as $3,000 for children 6 to 17. Probably gets complicated. It's taxes, but they are expanding the eligibility here. And in the second half of the year, they're going to give advance payments of this, which is good. It's one of the problems with tax credits is it's complicated and you don't get the money for a while when you actually need it. So ideally, a lot of this is going to get to families soon. It's like a UBI almost for families with children. Very cool, theoretically. They're also going to expand child independent care tax credits. You're going to earn income tax credits for workers without children in 2021, and then exempting student loan forgiveness from your income through 2025. So a lot of tax income and tax credit expansions. Number 4, money to fight the pandemic, which is big. This is going to help states, schools, local governments. So they're going to have money for COVID fighting. So that includes vaccine distribution, coronavirus testing, contact tracing, genomic sequencing, things like that. And then money for FEMA, which is our disaster relief organization at the federal level, which is good. And then $350 billion are going to states and local governments. So that includes colleges and universities, includes our schools and reopening them, transit agencies, housing, childcare providers, food assistance programs, things like that. And also businesses, restaurants and live venues. It includes a bailout for multi-employer pension plans that aren't able to make their payments to workers during the pandemic. Number 5, beefs up the Affordable Care Act. Regardless of what you think of it, it is a healthy healthcare. Millions of Americans use this to get their healthcare. So it's going to increase subsidies for people buying healthcare on healthcare.gov through the Affordable Care Act marketplace. So it's billions of dollars in public health programs and veterans healthcare. And if you have heard of COBRA, which is what you use to keep your healthcare when you lose your job, you're covered through September of this year. So they're expanding that as well. So the bottom line is, guys, those are your 5 things. You've got your $1,400 stimulus checks to people. You've got $300 per week boost to unemployment checks. You've got expanded tax credits, particularly a child tax credit. You've got money to fight the pandemic and reopen our schools and local governments. You've got Affordable Care Act subsidies and beefing that program up for people to get healthcare. Couple things. If you want to get your check, if you've already qualified for this and use direct deposit to file your taxes, you should get that soon as March 12th. We are going to post this link in our podcast description. There's a site where you can navigate the IRS and how to get your stimmy check. So get that stimmy check. It's irs.gov/coronavirus/get-my-payment. I'll just say from Yang and I's perspective, some pros and cons here. Pros. Guys, we freaking did something. Okay. You know what I'm saying? Our government did something, which is objectively a good thing. We don't normally do things. We've been very delayed in our coronavirus response. So thank God, thank heaven, thank whoever, we did something. We channeled a lot of Andrew Yang here. It's pretty exciting. There is a lot of cash relief, as I just read off. So that's exciting. I feel great as a human being in terms of the impact we have had on our society, despite how desperate the situation is. So Democrats are thrilled because this is a big win for Joe Biden getting this done. And I think people like this by the numbers, it appears. So 62% of Americans approve how Joe Biden is handling the pandemic. That's an NPR PBS poll. Trump was at 39% for context when he left office. 61% of Americans, according to CNN, approve it. So there's multiple polls saying that. And the big one, it seems that most people support what's in it, even if they don't approve Biden. So 85% or 75%, depending on the poll you're looking at, support cash relief and tax credits and reopening the schools and a lot of uses of the money. So I think this is generally objectively a positive thing. So that's a big pro. A couple cons here. I know I have my libertarian Republican listeners. We love you too. We are humanity first. I think it's fair. I'm a little frustrated that we can get $2,000 checks, but we'll take $1,400. Second thing, not a single Republican voted for this bill. Some press outlets have called this the end of bipartisanship. I'm not sure if that's true, but that was frustrating, which also made me frustrated because of the negotiation tactics used here, because the House original bill from the Democrats was actually more aggressive. And then they came down with a lot of their levels to negotiate, and then not a single Republican voted. So what was the point of, you should have just, if you're just going to have to force it through, you might as well get what you want. So the House originally wanted a $100,000 income minimum and a $200,000 income per couple. So that would have been better for more people. They wanted a $400 employment bump per week instead of $300. So that would have been better. A lot of people wanted the $15 minimum wage hike, but the Republicans were able to get that out. They had the ability to block it with a filibuster. That was too big of a move here. So I'm not sure what you think of the $15 minimum wage. We are more UBI than $15 minimum wage, but we are pro money in people's hands. So generally for paying workers more if you can do it realistically. But that was not included in this package. There are a lot of headlines on it. Hopefully, many of you are getting a stimmy check. And hopefully it's going to good use in a time where we all could use it. So now, sit back, relax. Kevin Roose is joining Yang Speaks.
I am so excited to welcome to the podcast my friend, the author, New York Times tech columnist, Kevin Roose. Kevin, welcome.
Andrew, thank you for having me. It's good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been too long. So Kevin wrote this book. I'm probably going to do this multiple times, but it's called Future Proof: 9 Rules for Humans in the Age of Automation. So you can see why I'm eager to talk to Kevin, because this is so up my alley. So my alley, I actually even gave a jacket quote to the book. so now it is in my interest to make sure that it sells gajillions of copies.
Yeah, I got the Yang bump, and I see the success of this book as or failure of this book as a referendum on your sway.
Yeah, it is. Or failure. It's true. It's like everyone just leave automation alone. Love the book. Super excited for people to get their hands on it. But first, I want to retrace our steps a little bit in your steps, because I think you're a great person to be delving into this topic from both your professional experience, but also even some of your personal origins. If you're watching this or listening to this podcast, you remember the launch of my presidential campaign. There was a story in the New York Times, said something like, the robots are coming, says this guy. That was written by Kevin Roose. Kevin Roose broke the entire presidential campaign story for the New York Times in early 2018.
Yeah, I still remember we had a sort of coffee in Dean and DeLuca, which no longer exists, in the bottom of the New York Times building, and we had met a couple times and kept in touch. But you said you had something to tell me, and I was like, all right, he's launching some startup, he's doing some, and we got there, and you sort of leaned in and you said, like, I'm running for president, and I was kind of like, president of what? Like, of your co-op? Like, of the, and you said, no, like, president of the United States. And I was just incredulous because you had no political profile. And I was like, that's cool. And like, how is this actually going to work? And then you proved me totally wrong. Or
I proved you right, because you did write the story.
That's true. That's true.
So you called me a longer than long shot, which I think was empirically accurate.
You did a lot better than I thought you were going to. And I was remembering this morning, after that story ran, we were having a New York Times tech conference out in Half Moon Bay, California. And you flew out to it, not as like a panelist or a speaker or anything, but just as sort of an audience member. And I remember there was a talk going on, and you raised your hand in the back of the room and asked a question, and you introduced yourself, and you said, I'm Andrew Yang, and I'm running for president to give people universal basic income because of automation. And there was like polite chuckling in the audience, but it's amazing how much has happened since then, and it's been wild to watch your success and the success with which you've really put this issue on people's minds. Because I think before you started running, automation, AI was seen as like a very niche issue that tech people cared about, but that other people didn't really know a ton about.
Certainly, our campaign succeeded in mainstreaming the issues of automation and universal basic income as a path forward. So I'm super grateful to everyone, but I am grateful to you, Kevin, because it took a real shot of journalistic judgment and vision to write that story. I remember you and I sat down, and when we sat down, I did not think that a story was going to come out of it. I wasn't like, ooh, I'm going to get together with Kevin, he's going to write about this. But you had a nose for it. And I remember, I think you even talked to someone on your team, maybe your editor, about it. And then we're like, hey, do you want to like do a story? And then, of course, at that point, I was like, heck yes. So what was that process? Did you end up pitching it to someone?
Yeah, I pitched it to my editor, and I was like, "This guy, Andrew Yang, is running for president because he's worried about the robots taking all the jobs and thinks we need universal basic income." And my editor, who's a very thoughtful guy, was sort of like, "So tell me why this should be a story again." So I had to kind of like convince people that it was worth their attention, because I thought, even if you were a longer than long shot, which I thought at the time, I thought the issue was one that I had never seen a candidate run so squarely on, this issue of automation, of technology is sort of changing the economy, and how do we deal with that? So I just thought, like, I'm a tech columnist. I'm not a political journalist. I don't handicap races. So I was just interested from the tech angle about the kind of way that you were trying to draw attention to this technology and how it was going to impact the workforce.
Well, grateful to you, Kevin. Grateful to your editor. Because that article really did put us on the map. I do remember the conference you were talking about too, and I was in the back, and I did raise my hand, and I said, "Hey, I'm Andrew Yang, running for president." And you're right; it was not met with raucous acclaim.
I think people were like, "How'd this guy sneak in?"
Indeed, security. Telling people privately you're running for president is different than after an article comes out. And then it's like, well, now I'm publicly running for president. And then, you have to make that case very often. That was an adjustment for me. Actually, every stage was an adjustment. Saying it privately was an adjustment, and then saying it publicly was an adjustment.
Yeah, but now look at you. You're a full-fledged political machine.
Well, I guess, thank you. You and I knew each other prior to that, and I think you're a singular voice on this in part because you grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, right?
Yep.
You experienced, or at least saw firsthand, some of these impacts on your hometown.
Yeah, I grew up in the Rust Belt. My county was one where there had been a lot of steel plants, and those closed up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, both because of a combination of automation and also offshoring and outsourcing. And so it's been a pretty economically hard hit region by this. And that was one of the reasons I was interested in it. And I was also interested because, and I don't know whether you experienced this, I'm sure you did, but the conversation about AI and automation out here in Silicon Valley is very bipolar. It's either everyone thinks, AI is amazing and it's going to solve all our problems and it's going to fix climate change and cure cancer, and we're all going to sort of be in this utopian society because AI is going to do all our dirty work for us. Or it's sort of like people are very dystopian, like Elon Musk and people, they think we're going to get super intelligence that's going to enslave us all. And it's all very far in the future, the way they talk about it. And I was struck when I started researching this book, of like how much is actually going on right now, like how much displacement is happening, how much AI is sort of working its way into all of our lives. And so I was trying to sort of do the micro version of the macro argument that you had, which was like, this stuff is changing the economy. These are the policies we need, including UBI and other things. And I sort of thought of myself as sort of the micro version of that argument, where it's like, yes, this stuff is coming. It's changing the economy. People are being displaced. So what can we as sort of non-politicians, as non-lawmakers actually do about it? How do we sort of orient our careers? How do we orient our habits and our lives and our communities so that this doesn't totally catch us off guard?
Well, it's one reason why I appreciate your book so much, is it tries to be useful on a personal level. And also talk about the immediate time frame, because I couldn't agree with you more that when you talk to people about this, even people that frankly should be very analytical, rigorous types, they have a tendency just to cut to some extreme statement of some kind, which I found very confusing and consistent when I was trying to make the case I was making. So the fact that you ran into the same thing in some ways doesn't surprise me, but it does discourage me because some time has passed.
Yeah, and the technology has gotten better and it's gotten more applied. So there are now companies that are automating jobs at a furious rate, and that's grown even since the pandemic. There's been a huge uptick in sales of automation software, hardware, robots, things like that. So I don't think people fully appreciate how quickly this is coming. And in Silicon Valley, people generally like to think on like a systems level, which is part of, what it means to be an engineer or a technologist. But I was, getting questions from people like, okay, well, what do I tell my kid to major in school? Or like, is my job going to get automated?
Yeah, you were trying to be practical on a useful level. And I will be the first to say that, one, I got that question a lot on the trail. And two, that my book does not even attempt to answer that question.
Well, you were taking a different approach, and I think we need both. I mean, I compare it to something like climate change, where like you need people thinking at the policy level about, what kind of tax structure do we need cap and trade? Do we need, carbon credits? Do we need, how can we address this at the macro level? But you also need someone to be saying, maybe don't buy that, beachfront development in Miami because that's all going to be underwater. And here are the things you can do in your own life, whether it's buying an electric car or something like that, to sort of decrease your own contributions to climate change. So that was sort of the approach I took, was like the kind of ultra personal, ultra applicable, practical advice for people to deal with this in their own lives.
All right, let's face it. Going to the post office is not fun. It's terrible. You have better things to do with your time, like learning to cook, which is what I'm doing in the pandemic. I made garlic mashed potatoes the other day, and they were dynamite. Little soupy, but very, very good. But regardless, your time is more valuable, and you need to stop going to the post office, and you need to start looking at Stamps.com. So Stamps.com brings the services of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS right to your computer. It's a must-have for any business, whether you're a small office sending out invoices, or an online seller shipping out orders, or even a giant warehouse sending thousands of packages a day. Stamps.com can handle it all with ease. So here's the deal. Stop wasting time by going to the post office and go to Stamps.com instead. There's no risk. And with our promo code YANG, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, free postage, and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in Yang. That's Stamps.com, promo code Yang. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again.
I think I've seen different quotes saying something like, we're going forward a matter of years and a matter of weeks or months because of COVID. What have you seen that maybe some other folks might have read about in passing in terms of what's happening economy-wide in the labor market?
Well, I think there are a couple things happening, and there are a couple reasons behind that acceleration. One is, I think the pandemic accelerated the demand for robots, software products. Factories needed to keep producing goods, even if their employees were, didn't want to be in the factory. FedEx, Tyson, the meat processor, lots of companies sort of brought in robots to sort of meet demand, even while their employees, some of them were out sick. And then you had the second reason, which was that the actual technology was just moving forward. I mean, we've had, this is a super fast moving area of tech. In the past 18 months, we've had new advances in robotics, in the sort of robot arms that can pick things in warehouses. That's taken a big step forward. These large language models like GPT-3, which are coming out of AI labs and threatened to replace, frankly, me.
So GPT-3, it's like a natural language AI that can produce simple journalistic accounts. People might have seen it online.
Yeah, not even simple journalistic accounts. The Guardian wrote an op-ed a few months ago using GPT-3, and there was an editor's note at the end of the article that said this article was actually easier to edit than a lot of op-eds that we get from humans. So it's getting fairly sophisticated. And then I think the third thing that the pandemic did was that it gave corporate executives cover to do the kinds of automation that they had wanted to do for years, but had waited on because they didn't want to be seen as job killers. So I talked to a number of executives and consultants who said, we could have automated our call center 5 years ago, but we didn't want to do that because, it wouldn't save us that much money. And it was, sort of marginal, but also, our workers might get scared that their jobs were going away. But during COVID, kind of all bets were off. And so a lot of companies called up their consultants and said, hey, let's do that automation project we talked about.
Well, part of it too is there were consumer preferences where, like in the old days, if you had like the self-driving pizza delivery vehicle or the self-checkout or the cleaning robots, and you're a customer, you're like, oh, it's a little bit spooky or eerie. But now you're like, ooh, fewer human hands touched my thing, like, that's a win. So I think it gave them cover in multiple ways.
Totally. Yeah. So McKinsey called this the Great Acceleration, and they said it's basically they revised their estimate of how many workers would be displaced by AI and automation by the end of the decade. And before the pandemic, it was 37 million, and now they've changed that to 45 million.
Another 8 million jobs. Thank you, McKinsey, for cataloging our disastrous times. Where would we be without McKinsey telling us how bad it's going to get? An extra 8 million jobs lost by decade's end is enormous. I was struck by what you called robotic process automation, or RPA. It's this very boring acronym. But it turns out it touches a lot of things, and that companies are like, ooh, like I can invest in these RPA bots very often, and they just end up simplifying processes and saving money.
Yeah, the chapter in the book is called "Beware of Boring Bots." Because I think when we think of automation and the risky kinds of AI, we think about, Skynet or, RoboCop.
Dude, I had the same freaking problem all the time on the trail. I had to constantly be like, look, it's not like a robot's going to show up to your office and replace you. Right. It doesn't work quite like that.
Right. So, and the RPA thing is fascinating because RPA, robotic process automation, is like the most boring part of the AI industry. Like it is the least sexy. They don't win prizes. It's basically software programs that can be installed inside large corporations to do the work that Phil in accounting used to do. It can process invoices and approve expense reports and plug into databases and
think Dunder Mifflin. Think all the people hanging out in that office.
Exactly. So now if they made the office in 2021, it would just be like 4 RPA bots talking to each other. But I was fascinated by this because I didn't basically know it existed, and I started going to all these conferences and talking to all these executives in the RPA market, and they are really blunt about the fact that this technology is replacing people.
I mean, there was one thing that was called like the boomer remover, which is so dark. I mean, I shouldn't laugh because it was literally, it's like, hey, we can replace an elderly worker.
Yeah, this was a guy I met at a cocktail party in San Francisco, and he came up to me and introduced himself when he said, I've got this AI software called the boomer remover, and it basically lets companies replace sort of middle managers. And he was very proud of that. And I was thinking to myself, like, this is going to be a total disaster. I had sort of the same feeling that I'm guessing you had early in your sort of conversion on this stuff, where it's like, oh man, if there's one of these people selling boomer remover software, there's got to be thousands of them. And this is happening all over the economy. And what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the moments for me was talking to a very high-end venture capitalist based in Boston who was like, yeah, about 2/3 of the stuff I'm seeing is going to get rid of significant numbers of jobs. And I was like, well, you're literally someone who's just staring at the system. And it made sense to me too intuitively that the low-hanging fruit for a lot of tech companies is going to be saving labor costs, because you have to try and show where your financial returns are going to come from, and imagining that all of the financial returns are going to come from these, blue sky. It made much more sense to me that you could replace Phil, and then there are a million Phils, and that's enough to grow some very, very significant companies. So we all had our moments, Kevin, and I just want to dig into something you just said, which is interesting. So you're a New York Times tech reporter, and you go to conferences. Like, how does that work? Are you like, hey, I want to go to this conference, the New York Times, and then when you get there, are you media? Like, do people react to you like they're just pitching you their stuff because they want publicity for their company?
It works a lot of ways. I mean, this was pre-COVID, obviously, when there actually were conferences. Now I just show up on Zoom. But pre-COVID, I would go because I was covering it, or there was a talk I wanted to hear, or I was on a panel or speaking. But conferences are where a lot of this stuff happens, or at least where it's announced. And so, there's a scene in the book where I went to Davos, which is like, I don't know if have you ever been to Davos?
I have not been to Davos, Kevin.
Man.
Tell us more.
Well, it is...
Davos seemed like a trip.
So Davos is like I call it the Coachella of capitalism. It's like this, week-long retreat in the Swiss Alps where all these CEOs and billionaires and heads of state get together, and celebrities go and they fly their private jets in, and it's like the biggest, most gaudy conference that basically ever has existed. And I've only been the one time. This was in 2019, but the thing that I was struck by was how different the conversations that I heard were on the record and off the record. So like during the day, how Davos
works.
You
mean
is,
the masters of the universe don't sound exactly the same when a microphone is on and when they're at the bar, Kevin?
No, it was like a total 180. And maybe I'm naive because I was just shocked. But like during the day, they would have all these panels and they would talk about, we're doing human-centered automation to, free up workers and bring in, prosperity. And this is going to be great for everyone. And then at night, I would like go to these dinners and I would sit next to, the CEO of some Fortune 500 company. And he'd be like grilling the guy next to him who, worked at some tech company about like, how can I get rid of my back office? So it was really stark and really frightening how eager the corporate executives were to just get rid of as many people as possible. And like this, but the classic comeback, the classic thing that people say is, well, technology has always gotten rid of jobs, but it always creates more jobs. And so I started looking at that and found that really, the evidence for that just really isn't there this time.
So lazy, man. It infuriated me. Again, people who are supposed to be pretty analytical would just bust shit out on me. And I'd be like, look, if someone walked into your office and busted out a 120-year-old fact pattern on you, you'd like throw them out. You'd be like, well, I've got some I've got like a buggy whip case study. You'd be like, oh, I should invest for sure. Like the whole thing just struck me as so self-serving and ridiculous and lazy. You could imagine, like I did get that an awful lot. That's quite dark, but not surprising to me again that the conversations in private were so different from the panels. Give us some more Davos dirt, Kevin. It'll be fun.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's hilarious. So I was there as a journalist, and the way that Davos works is there's like a hierarchy of badge colors. So like if you are like a inner circle, like super elite, you get like one, I forget which color it is. It's like a pink badge or something like that, a gold badge or something. And then there's sort of 6 or 7 tiers below that. And I was like, press is like the lowest tier. And so there are a lot of things that, you just can't get into as a journalist. But there are some things that you can get into. And so I managed to weasel my way into some pretty funny events. But it's basically, it's this whole sort of do-gooder ethos, and everyone there is, interested in humanitarian pursuits and philanthropy. And like, it's sort of, that's the Davos that you see. And then the one that you don't see is like everyone just getting like drunk at night and, gossiping and hanging out with celebrities. And it's sort of a big party.
What is life if you're not trying to better yourself? That's been one of the hardest things in the pandemic, is like keeping that growth mindset. And I've found some fascinating stuff with Skillshare. And Skillshare sponsors this episode, Yang Speaks. What I love about it is that you can take classes on a whole bunch of different topics. I've been doing more on like entrepreneurship and just trying to learn new specific skills. So I took a class on how to use Evernote because my notes are a disaster, and Evernote's a pretty cool like app. software to organize and search your notes so you can't lose them. But the point is, there's all these different things you can learn on arts, creativity, like Instagram, freelancing, marketing, photography, all this crazy stuff. And it's this online learning community that offers membership with meaning, with so much to explore. There's actual projects to create and support of fellow creatives, which is pretty cool. So explore your creativity at skillshare.com/yang and get a free trial of premium membership. It's free. Pretty awesome. The annual subscription is less than $10 a month. So it's not like super pricey compared to some of these other crazy online classes you can take. So that's skillshare.com/yang.
So now we turn to the personal, useful advice you would give to someone who is listening to this podcast and saying, oh, wow, Yang has been talking about this for a while. Kevin Roose is another person who knows what's happening on the ground in tech. So there is cause for concern. But Kevin's here with his book to actually try and guide people in the right direction. And so you have 9 rules that people can follow. And I found some of them to be really affecting, particularly the one, and you probably know this, the one around how our phones are reprogramming our brain, our brains, which they are. But the first rule you propose is be surprising, social, and scarce. What do you mean by that?
So this rule came out of conversations I had with people who work on AI. And I went to them and I asked them, okay, what can humans do that computers can't do? Like what is AI just like not very good at? Because it seemed to me that we've sort of that's where the future is going to be for us, is we need to do the things that machines aren't very good at. And so they told me that basically there were 3 categories of things that AI was pretty terrible at. One is tasks that are surprising. So artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning, they really like structured, regular problems. So this is why, they're very good at playing chess, for example, because it has consistent rules. It's sort of a bounded universe, and the rules are the same every time. They don't change a lot. So humans, by contrast, we're really good at doing things that are surprising, that involve sort of new situations and sort of coming up with creative solutions to chaotic problems. So like an AI would be a horrible kindergarten teacher, because that's just like a job that like is all surprises and all chaos. So that's the first kind of thing I think we as humans should focus on, is doing things that are not routine and repetitive. And so the second category is social jobs. These are pretty safe from automation. And those are jobs that that you've talked a lot in your work, but they're the jobs that involve not making things, but making people feel things. So, your nurses, your therapists, your clergy, your teachers, but also jobs that are not, we don't think of as being sort of social jobs, but that have a strong social component, like bartenders. I suspect that even if there are robot bartenders who can pour drinks, it's the reason you like going to a bar is not because the drinks are so good. It's because you get to talk to humans, and that's a big part of what makes that job hard to automate. And then the third category would be scarce jobs, which are jobs that are basically involve rare skills, combinations of skills, people who are excellent in their fields, and also jobs that sort of you really, really need them to be done right the first time. There's not a whole lot of margin for error. So an example of this is when you call 911 to report an emergency, a human picks up the phone. And it's not because we don't know how to automate those jobs. It's because when you're in trouble, you don't want to have to wade through a phone menu. You want to talk to a human right away. And so those are the jobs that we've sort of decided as a society should be done by humans, even if machines can do them just as well.
One of the categories that I talked about on the trail is non-routine manual. And I made a couple of examples. I said, look, you're not going to have an Edward Scissorhands robot virtually ever. It's like you don't think of hairdresser or stylist as something that obviously involves like a ton of education or credentialing, but it's very, very safe and resilient because of some of the social aspects you're talking about, but also just that, there are a lot of non-routine manual jobs that will be with us for quite some time. And a lot of them do have a social component, and maybe there's some surprise involved with them too.
Yeah, I mean, one job that I sort of am fascinated by is the barista. I mean, this is a job that should have been automated 60 years ago. We all have machines called coffee makers in our house. They make pretty good coffee. And so you would expect that, coffee shops that sold coffee would be, a sort of dying breed. And yet in any major city, there's a coffee shop on every corner. And why is that? It's because it's not actually just about the coffee. It's about the human interaction, the connection, the talking to people, the sort of atmosphere. It's an experience rather than a purchasing a good.
Your next suggestion is to resist machine drift. This is about how machines are kind of guiding our behaviors in different ways.
Yeah, so machine drift is the name that I gave to this feeling that I kept having. You
made it up, Kevin? Machine drift is your thing? We could make it a thing?
Yeah, we could sell merch. The idea was that there are all these ways in which we are being sort of subtly influenced by non-human forces. So, I am a tech writer. I have so many gadgets in my house. I use every app.
That is dangerous, man, because then you can justify yourself, like, oh, it's my job.
Exactly. So every day I wake up, I check Twitter, I talk to, my Alexa, I play my Spotify playlist that's automatically generated. So I'm interacting with probably a dozen AIs before I have my morning cup of coffee. And a few years ago, I started realizing this wasn't really making me happier or more efficient. What it was doing is changing my behavior and my preferences. And I would get, I subscribed to this algorithmic wardrobe service. This is pretty dystopian, but there are these services where
they're very popular.
Go and they'll, you put in your dimensions and your sizes and they, analyze your style, and then they send you a box of sort of clothes that were picked out by an algorithm. So I was I did that for a while, and I was letting an algorithm dress me. And I would have these moments where I was I don't even like the way this thing looks, but I'm wearing it because the algorithm told me to. So it was a real moment of I have drifted toward these machines without.
Who are you to
realizing
put your taste above the algorithm, Kevin? Come on.
Was that shirt picked out for you by an algorithm?
This shirt was picked out for me months ago by someone who worked on my campaign, and now I've got a dozen of them, and so I just wear the same shirt all the time. It's really not great. But it wasn't an algorithm, it was a human. Nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Triumph of humanity. Andrew's ubiquitous blue shirt.
Exactly. So this was sort of the way in for me to talk about this sort of sensation of algorithmic influence.
Well, I think a lot of us have had that drift feeling. I mean, the most straightforward time is when you're just on YouTube or some site and it just keeps feeding you stuff, and you're just good to do.
Totally. Yeah. No. And it's not just about clothes and YouTube videos. It's this is affecting our politics. This is affecting how we
the content
see
we
ourselves.
See, for sure. Yeah.
It's affecting our identities. And so the reason I wanted to address this in the book is because I think that in order to be more human, which is what I think we need to do when machines take over more and more of the things we used to do. But in order to be more human, we have to know what we're trying to preserve. You have to know who you actually are, what you actually believe, what preferences are actually yours, and which were put there by Instagram and Amazon and Spotify.
That's very deep, my friend. Very profound.
I know. So that's my attempt to sort of say we have to get ourselves under control. Put your own oxygen mask on first. That's sort of the approach that I'm taking.
Wow. And so one of the oxygen masks you suggest is to try to discipline your device usage. And you wrote a story that apparently caught fire where you talked about trying to change your relationship with your smartphone in particular, which I can understand why it's so popular, because I think a lot of us have a relationship with our smartphone that we are not excited about.
Yeah, I mean, this was written before, that part was written before COVID. And it's funny, I was reading back through it the other day, and there's a statistic in there where I said I was expressing my horror at the fact that I was on my phone for 6 hours a day, according to my screen time statistics. And then, like, I feel like that no longer registers as alarming, because during the pandemic, we're all on our screens much more than that. But this is also a piece of the sort of future-proofing yourself, because it's not about how much you use your phone, but it is about how much power you delegate to your phone. I remember when I got my first smartphone, it was a BlackBerry, and it was cool. It was like a tool. It was like you could use it for all kinds of things. But now, with how sophisticated our smartphones are, like every time you open your smartphone and you open a social media app or you use it in any way, like there are billions of dollars in R&D and dozens of PhDs in artificial intelligence who are pointing a supercomputer right at you and trying to influence what you think and believe and how you act. And so putting the phone back in its rightful place as an assistant rather than a boss is part of what I'm trying to encourage people to do here.
One of the things I adopted a while ago was sleeping in a different room as my cell phone, which is something you recommend as well. But you had more recommendations than that, like have a rubber band on the phone to try and introduce friction. Like what were the other steps?
Yeah, so the rubber band was first, and that doesn't really change anything about the phone, but it does make it a little harder to use, which is sort of the point, just to kind of notice it. And I worked with a phone coach. I had a woman named Catherine Price who is sort of an expert in phone detoxes, and so she was sort of my personal guru on this.
What is her website? Because there's some people listening to this that are like, I totally want to do this.
Yeah, well, her book is called How to Break Up with Your Phone. And it's a great book, and she's got another one out now that's called Screen Life Balance. And she's amazing, and she really helped me sort of recognize how big a problem I had, and then go through the steps to fix it. But it's really about using your phone not necessarily less, but just in a more mindful way, and not just to reaching for it because you're bored or you can't be alone with your thoughts.
Well, I had one experience that certainly hit me, which is that I was with my family, which when I was running for president was like a very rare thing. But then, this was after I came off the trail. And then I saw something on social media that bothered me and put me in a bad mood. And then when I was doing something with my kids, I wasn't enjoying it properly because of the thing. And then I was like, wait a minute. What is going on here? Like, I'm letting this thing I saw on social media on my phone mess with my family time in a way that, frankly, when I was on the trail, I would have given anything to have this kind of family time because I was away so much. And then here I was misusing it because of something like that someone I never met. And that really hit home for me. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to change my ways here because this is unacceptable. I think a lot of folks, if you haven't had that kind of experience, kudos to you. But I feel like a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Catherine, my phone coach, told me that really stuck with me is she said, your life is what you pay attention to. And I think about that all the time because I think we have really devalued our own attention. We look at our phones hundreds of times a day. They tell us what to think, when to think it. They are our ultimate task schedulers. And I think there's a process that a lot of us have gone through of realizing exactly what you realize, which is I am not in control of my own attention anymore. And trying to get some of that back is part of what I think we need to do.
Yeah, there's another term in your book that I enjoyed called phubbing, which is short for phone snubbing, which is when you're with a loved one, but you're just staring at your phone instead of your loved one, which I will confess has happened occasionally in the Yang household. So I think that's another yellow flag for someone when you look over at your loved one or they look at you and you're both just heads down.
Totally. And it's not just rude, although it is definitely rude and people, rightly call me on it, including my wife when I do it. But it's also depriving us of these kind of emotional skills that we need to build in order to distinguish ourselves from machines. There have been studies that find that, people who even just having your phone on the table next to you when you're having a meal with someone, even if it's not ringing, even if it's on do not disturb, just even having it there like dramatically reduces your ability to listen, and it decreases your enjoyment of the time that you're spending with that person.
All right, this podcast is brought to you by Liquid IV. I had this morning. I had the watermelon flavor. Why? I was tired. I had a glass of wine with dinner. I'm 33 years old, and it makes me way more hungover than I should be. So I took a little bit of water and poured in some Liquid IV, mixed it all up, pounded it, and I felt great. This stuff is awesome. You get more energy, a little bit of caffeine, a ton of vitamins. It's just like injecting your system with water, and you don't get the crash like you do when you're hammering yourself with coffee or things like that. So there's matcha in there, ginger. There's all those amazing antioxidants that make things great, improve your mood and your focus. I use it all the time, specifically today before recording this. So grab your Energy Liquid IV in bulk nationwide at Costco. Heyo, love Costco. Or get 25% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use code YANG, Y-A-N-G, as you know, at checkout. That's 25% off anything when you use your promo code YANG at liquidiv.com. So start fueling your adventure today. liquidiv.com, promo code YANG.
One of the principles you put out is to leave handprints, which I enjoyed. This was like trying to leave an imprint that like the machine couldn't, trying to humanize something that you're doing. And this, I think, could help a lot of people keep their roles from being automated by trying to see where they can actually inject more humanity.
Yeah, this was one of the biggest questions I had going in, was like, what are people doing? You know, because there are people whose jobs, frankly, should have been automated all throughout history. But they never were for some reason. And so those kind of like unlikely survivors. And I wanted to try to find their stories and figure out what had actually allowed them to keep their jobs and their relevance, even as technology, supposedly made them obsolete. And so I started finding a lot of stories like that from, people who were, 18th or 19th century factory workers and people who, survived the Industrial Revolution, people in car factories in the 1960s who were able to survive that. And then I found people who were doing that kind of thing today. Like the example I use in the book is my accountant. And, if you think of accountants, you think that job probably got automated because TurboTax, made it obsolete. But he's thriving. And one of the reasons he's thriving is that he's a former stand-up comedian. And he hires other accountants who are former comedians and entertainers, and he pays for them all to get improv comedy classes because he thinks it makes them better at relating to clients. And as a result, like, it's really fun to do your taxes. Like, people do not believe me when I say that I have fun talking with my accountant.
Well, the funniest thing is that his name is actually funny. It was like Brass Taxes. Was that what?
Yeah, it's Brass Taxes, and he's just a great example of how you can stay afloat in an industry that has been rapidly automated.
In the most boring industry alive.
By being a human. And that's, I think, what's happening to people in a lot of fields is they're having to lean more on their human skills because, just being a talented accountant probably isn't enough to keep you relevant. Just being a talented radiologist in the future, when AI is reading all of our scans, being a talented radiologist is not going to cut it. You'll also have to bring some human skills to the table. So I think we need to work on those skills, because what happened to accountants is going to happen to journalists and professors and artists. There are no sort of robot-proof jobs.
I had an experience on the trail that this reminded me of, Kevin, where I was running for president. Most people were ignoring me, and that every once in a while, when we had a breakthrough, it would be because I did something very human. Sometimes something that I frankly found like uncomfortable or embarrassing. But then, if it happened enough, then I started, obviously adapting. And I'll actually describe this to you because you probably don't know this. So I started running for president 2018, and it is a slog. Like, no one cares. No one's paying attention. A lot of people are kind of bemused. We're not able to raise much money, very, very limited press. And a lot of it is because in 2018, no one was talking about the presidential election. So I was way, way ahead of the curve. It was very difficult. And then in 2019, we started doing better. And there were a number of kind of social media moments that some people might remember. One was me crowd surfing. Another one was me doing the Cupid Shuffle. And there were other things that genuinely at the time I was like a little bit uncomfortable about, where I was like, I seem like kind of a goof. But then I would do a major news interview and they would just be asking me about that and not whatever, policy platform I'd put out. And so, again, you start adapting. And so I think I can actually relate somewhat to what you're arguing for about trying to lean into your humanity. Because when I was on the trail and I was trying to be all, frankly, putting out very big ideas and policies out there, people wouldn't pay as much attention than if I was, jazzercising or whatever the heck it, the example is.
Yeah, totally. And I remember from your campaign, I mean, I remember during one of the debates, you were up there and you were, up there with a lot of the other sort of Democrats in the primary. And a friend who knew that I knew you, texted me and it says, he seems like the only human up there because, you weren't super polished. You didn't, you weren't giving well-rehearsed, you were saying things that were, grammatically correct and true
for the most part,
but you weren't, it wasn't like you were reading off a teleprompter. And so much of what I think made your candidacy appealing to people was that you were able to just kind of talk like a human and act like a human and not some political automaton built in a lab. And I think that's really instructive for not just people running for office, but for people in all kinds of fields. I think your ability to sort of be a human and talk like a human and relate to people like a human is really an underrated thing. And it's not easy to do when everyone's trying to train that out of you, but you were able to do it.
Yeah, it was an adaptation. It took me about a year because necessity is the mother of invention and all that. But I'm really glad your friend said you that. I mean, that's super gratifying.
All right, I just got my new, and I've said this before, so now I've got my second new Helix mattress because I like the first one, got another one. Helix mattresses are like sleeping on the pillow, if you will, like a massive pillow. They're so freaking comfortable. And I got a king, so it's literally swimming in it. So you go online, you take a 2-minute quiz, talk about how you sleep, which way you sleep, on your back, on your side, and then you find a mattress that they have that works for you. And it's so awesome, but you don't have to take my word for it because Helix was awarded #1 best overall mattress pick of 2020 by GQ and Wired magazine. If you go to helix.com/yang, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress and it'll give you the best sleep of your life. I can say that with authority because I love my mattress. They have a 10-year warranty. You get to try it out for 100 nights. It's totally risk-free. They'll even pick it up for you if you don't love it. So here's the deal. Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners at helixsleep.com/yang. So that's Helix, HELIX, sleep.com/yang for up to $200 off and 2 free pillows.
There was another idea in your book that was very, very important, I thought. I mean, there are a lot of important ideas, you can tell. But one was about people innovating better when they're physically proximate to each other. And so you quote a number of people. The CEO of Adobe, Shantanu Narayan, says that when you're trying to create a new project, you want people around that water cooler. And there was a study that said that even academics tended to produce better research when they were located closer to each other. And I thought this was such like an important counter argument to like the Zoom moment we're in. And apparently you'd even written a bunch of a chapter that you then had to rewrite or discard because of COVID, when you were like, in-person collaboration is where it's at. But would love for you to unpack a bit about what you found on how people are the most productive or happy in terms of work environments.
Yeah, well, there's the chapter you talk about was in the pre-COVID version of the book, and it was all about how sort of remote work is a trap for workers because
it's a trap. When you say that, it's like Star Wars.
Well, yeah. So the research is actually fairly clear on this question. Studies have found over and over again that remote workers are more productive than people in an office on average, in part because, they're not spending 2 hours a day commuting. They're not distracted. It's much easier to be productive when you're at home. I guess we should say like this was before COVID when people's kids were crawling all over them and stuff. But in general, workers who work from home are more productive, but they're less creative. It's harder for them to sort of collaborate on big projects, to come up with new ideas. And this has been known in the corporate world for a long time. It's why, Google and Apple and Facebook and all these tech companies that literally build the tools that remote workers use, they have giant corporation offices in Silicon Valley where tens of thousands of people come to work every day, again, pre-COVID. And that's because they understand that good ideas come in many cases from these kind of random collisions between people, from being in the same place, thinking about things, sitting in conference rooms together, the kind of moments between meetings. That's where a lot of the sort of innovation happens. So I think that's part of what worries me about this shift to remote work that we're seeing now with COVID is it seems to be working for some people, but like I feel less creative when I'm at home than when I'm in a newsroom with, my colleagues making phone calls and, talking and I can hear their conversations and it might strike some idea. And so I think remote workers have to be very careful not to let themselves get sort of dehumanized by that process. And there's some tips in the book for how to do that. But I think that's really important because in a sense, like remote workers are kind of halfway automated already. And so I think
Wow. That's such a powerful statement.
Well, I mean, think about it. It's like you are visible to your team mostly as sort of a name in their inbox or a Slack, username. The way to measure your productivity is by like the number of tasks you complete. And you miss out on a lot of those kind of like moments between tasks, the experience of being in an office, of making relationships, of, building trust, of mentoring people. The kind of softer parts of the office experience are actually really, really important. So I think workers, including me, who are working remotely right now, are going to have some sort of rehumanizing to do when all this is over and we can go back to the office.
So you hear that, people? When the heads of various departments are like, hey, want you back in the office, like don't reflexively be like, no. Like maybe heading back is actually, maybe they're looking out for you. Maybe by having you back in the office, you're going to have all different ways to add value that would not be possible over Zoom. I mean, I genuinely believe this because I've been in a number of organizations, and the argument I make, which is very similar to the argument you're making, though you're making it, and yours is based on data, around the fact that creative collaborative work is just better in person, and studies bear that out. The thing that I'm arguing for is somewhat similar, which is that it's very hard to build a culture remotely. And if you're going to try and cultivate younger workers and have them become important parts of your org and then eventually become managers and leaders, I think you need to have them in the office. I think that someone joked with me and said it's very hard to get promoted over Zoom.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's what I've been hearing from remote workers since the pandemic started. I mean, obviously we should say like people should not rush back to the office until it's safe to do so and all the vaccines are out. Like there's no reason to jeopardize your safety to go to an office. But I do think a lot of companies are going to find that maybe they didn't come up with as many new innovations during the pandemic. Maybe their creativity suffered a little bit. Maybe they're not, having as many sort of breakthroughs I think that's going to be really interesting to see how many companies sort of stay mostly remote and how many companies come back to the office and which of them do better.
Yeah, I genuinely think there's going to be a competitive advantage over time to organizations that have more face-to-face proximity. To me, a lot of it really is about where you are in your career. Where if you're a bit older and you've kind of gotten stuff down, and then you feel like, okay, I can beam in remotely and get stuff. But again, if you're younger and developing, I think meeting in person and working in person is vital to how people's careers grow and develop. And I think that a lot of this discussion is kind of misleading because a lot of the people who are doing the discussion are frankly in the first category where they're kind of more mature.
Totally.
And so so they talk about it like, hey, I can just zoom in. It's like, well, sure, but you've been at your job for 18 years.
Totally. And I'm thinking about, when I started off as a journalist, and so much of how I learned was just by watching over people's shoulders, by, grabbing them in the lunch line and saying, hey, how did you do that thing, in that paragraph? Like just a sort of subtle people watching that you get to do in an office. And I'm not sure how I would have gotten those skills if I had just been at home, typing into a laptop.
We're grateful that you are where you are, Kevin. Your last big principle I thought was super important. I just want you to unpack it. It's called arm the rebels. What the heck do you mean by arm the rebels, Kevin Roose?
Well, it's not as violent as it sounds. I'm a pacifist, so I chose that language sort of carefully. But I think that one of the ways that we who are not technologists can support the development of ethical and humanizing technology is by supporting the people inside the tech industry who are working to make it better. There are a lot of examples of this. People at Google and Amazon and Facebook, rank and file workers who are trying to do the right thing. And there are also people who are sort of in the tech industry, even if they're not in the sort of biggest companies, who are doing startups that are public good startups that are trying to sort of steer technologies like AI in a more humane direction. There are, activists who are trying to get the use of facial recognition software by law enforcement banned or sort of prohibited at a kind of state level. And I think these are important people in the whole picture of technology. I think often we think, we forget that those people are there and they don't get as much attention as the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks, but they're super important. And so I think arming the rebels means figuring out who those people are and supporting them with what they need, whether it's, fundraising or attention. It's why I try to bring attention to some of those people in my Times column, because I think it's really important that there be incentives for people to do this stuff ethically.
Try and do the right thing, because there's so much money in, frankly, doing things as they're currently done. So anyone who's trying to go against that grain is really, really swimming against a very powerful current.
Yeah, absolutely. But they're there.
Well, so that's hopeful. You talk to hundreds of people in tech. What proportion of them fall into this category where you see them as activists who are trying to improve things?
I don't know how to put a number on it, but I think I think it can be hard to identify them because I think a lot of the executives have learned how to talk like they are ethical technologists. But you really have to look at actions. I mean, one of the principles I look at in the book is this idea of consequentialism, of sort of the need for technologists to kind of measure their success not based on how they intended their products to work, but on how their products actually work out in the world.
Well, right now they're measuring how their products performing by engagement and how much money they're making. I don't even know if there's like like a how it's supposed to work measurement in there.
Right. But when they're challenged, when you say, Mark Zuckerberg, your newsfeed algorithm is tearing society apart or leading to more polarization, the fallback response is always, well, we built this with good intentions. And what I'm trying to tell people is like, it doesn't matter. Like your intentions are it's good that if they're good, but what ultimately matters is how this technology is applied out in the world. And,
that's a very strange standard, man. Like if I'm a doctor and then I do something messed up, And then, it's like like whatever, I operate on the wrong leg, and then they would be like, "Hey, that was the wrong leg." I'd be like, "Well, I intended it to be the right leg." I mean,
Right.
that's not exactly like a compelling argument in just about any field.
Right. But you hear that all the time in tech. And I think it's really ingrained in them that as long as you have good intentions, your job is just to create the technology, and how people use it is up to them.
That is not great. Yeah, I mean, they definitely should be measuring impact and then say like, hey, is this impact working or not working? Certainly, I'm very passionate about a lot of the stuff you're writing about, in part because I can see the impact as being very negative in some respects. And you can see it with the eroding mental health of various people, particularly teenage girls, in response to some of the social media apps that we're using. And you'll never see that show up in anyone's financial statement. But it's destructive and devastating to certain people and certain families. They're growing negative externalities with a lot of our use of technology that, again, like we're not measuring correctly. If you were to incorporate that measurement, then things would look different. But these tech companies, as you're describing, like don't feel themselves to be particularly culpable for some of the negative externalities, because they're like, well, we wanted to build something awesome. We made a lot of money, and if there's something less than awesome going on, we can make some good sounding noises at like a panel, and then all will be well. And you're just like, well, that didn't really solve the problem.
Yeah, well, I'm actually like more optimistic on this front than I used to be, and I think because I'm meeting so many of these sort of rebels, I know that there are people who are pushing for change in a good direction. And historically, I for this book, I went back and I read a lot about the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, the third industrial revolution. And in each of those, there were people who were agitating to make humans' lives better as a result of this new technology, and not just use it to enrich executives and shareholders. There are people in every technological age who are not anti-tech. It doesn't mean being anti-tech. It doesn't mean being anti-automation. It doesn't mean being a Luddite. What it means is all these technologies can improve humans' lives, or they can make them worse. And there are people in the industry and outside of the industry who are trying to make the best version of this technology for the age that we're living in and that's coming up.
Well, kudos to you for being one of the conscientious voices that, in your case, I mean, you cover the tech industry, but you in many ways represent the way a lot of people will understand the tech industry, given your prominence as one of the foremost tech journalists at the New York Times. So the book is Future Proof: 9 Rules for Humans in the Age of Automation. And Kevin, you have your own podcast. If people want to follow you and all of your learnings, where can they go?
Well, they can go to my website, kevinroose.com, or there's a special website just for the book called futureproofthebook.com.
And you can follow him on social media. He's a very good follow. He's constantly sharing nuggets of insight about what's coming down the pike. I learn a lot from Kevin Roose. I hope you did too on this podcast. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the heck out of you. And thank you for this massive contribution with this book. May it help many, many people.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk.